Look at these 3 words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Ask an Attorney. I'm your host, John Aarons. I'm feeling a lot better this week. I think we had a fill-in, right?
We did, yes. We had my legal secretary, Alex, filling in for you. Did a great job, but we're really happy to have you back, John.
Yeah. Glad to be back. He actually did do a good job. I was only slightly jealous I got replaced so easily, but that's okay. I know the salary's pretty high and attractive, so we'll just keep them coming through. I thought he did good, though.
I thought he did, too. Yeah. So you got an understudy now. If you can't do it again in the future, well, don't need to worry too much. I know John's a busy guy. We're grateful for the time he gives us.
Oh, so. I'm glad to be here. I'm also actually very grateful to the audience and everybody else, but you particularly. It's nice to know that I'm not the only one who you get laughing during this show.
That's my goal. I'm told lawyers are boring, so we're fighting the stigma on this.
Not true. Not this lawyer.
Well, I hope not. I think some of our older videos were boring, but not this one. Let's jump right into the topic.
No, the new thing. Yeah, let's jump right in. So last time I checked, there was some big news. We had the longest reigning monarch in history, if I'm not mistaken, pass away.
British monarch. I'm sure
oldest British monarch.
Someone somewhere else that served longer.
Clarify that. So longest reigning British monarch has passed away. Queen Elizabeth II has passed on. I guess
the Queen is dead. Long live the King.
And God rest her soul. But the long live the King aspect. For some reason, to me, that's a little eerie. I don't know why it was so much less threatening to have the Queen versus a king now. I just thought that was interesting.
Maybe just women are less threatening. Maybe you're just a sexist, John.
Well, we won't go into that. That's another episode on the podcast, which is not true. Okay, not true. I believe in women. I think they're stronger than us in every way.
I think a lot of what you're experiencing isn't just that we have a king now. It's that for all of our lifetimes, we've been used to having a queen ruling on the British throne.
Absolutely.
And succession is kind of a weird thing, right? I mean, it's
kind of weird.
You put somebody in charge of a country where basically their name and their face stands for that country. You know, she's on all of their money for decades. It's a little bit strange to switch to somebody else.
Well, I think so too, and I think personally, most Americans, and I'm not putting us down, but I think most Americans could probably better explain the succession behind the movie Game of Thrones, the series of Game of Thrones, which I like. I'm not advertising for that, but I think we probably could because we're eating that up.
Sure.
We're Americans. We're not Britons. If you're British, that's fine. Nothing against you. But that brings up my question for AAA, or Ask an Attorney, which would be, what does succession look like in Britain? Could you touch base a little bit on that?
Well, the funny thing is, succession in Game of Thrones is actually quite a bit more complicated than it is in Britain.
Really?
Because Britain, and I'm going to get into this. Please, don't let me bore you too much, everybody, because frankly, laws of inheritance are probably one of the most detailed. And there's a hilarious scene at the beginning of the Shakespeare play, Henry V.
Yeah.
Which a lot of times it's played for laughs, sometimes it's played seriously, but it's basically 2 advisors to the king are telling him why he has a valid claim to the throne of France, and they're going through all these different lines of people saying, well, but they use the Salic law, and the Salic law doesn't allow inheritance for the female line, but does allow females to inherit, because those are separate issues, which we'll get into in a second. Okay. But because of that, you have the right to the throne of France. And they say, it ends, "'Tis clear as is the summer sun that you are the rightful king of France." Obviously, I think the audience is supposed to look at that, and actually, I had a law professor in law school. Actually, the law professor was John Eastman. For those of you who are watching this,
John Eastman?
John Eastman showed us that clip.
You guys better know who John Eastman is.
And he pointed out, well, he had something to do with succession in the U.S. context, but he very fittingly showed us that scene in his property law class, and he pointed out, no, it actually is clear as is the summer sun that Henry V is supposed to inherit here. So he's got opinions on succession, whether way back when or whether today, and I think that he has very strong, very well-supported legal theories on that stuff.
I think we'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's succession can get very complicated.
Yeah.
But let's get into the way it works in Great Britain.
Okay.
So this is from William Blackstone. We've talked about William Blackstone before in this series, as well as in a lot of Electoral other stuff. He was sort of the founding father's Bible when it came to the way that the law worked at the time the Constitution was written. He was writing in 1750s, and he wrote a book called Commentaries on the Laws of England that basically explicated what are the laws that we have in England. And he devotes fully 23 pages to how the laws of succession work for the British Crown.
Okay, full 23 pages. Just for context, is that a lot? Is that a little?
It's
bit?
a lot.
Because
I don't know. It's quite a bit. It's quite. I mean, because most people I would think would say, well, the oldest son becomes king, over and done, right? We don't have anything else to say. How do you fill 23 pages?
Yeah,
right.
Makes sense.
Not quite so simple in England. So what he has to say is this. He begins the section by saying, the executive power of the English nation being vested in a single person. So again, that's very similar to America. Executive power vested in the president.
Right.
It's vested in the king or the queen over in Britain. By the general consent of the people. So again, government derived from consent of the governed. They have that in Britain as well. The evidence of which general consent is long and immemorial usage. In other words, we show that people have consented to a king by the fact that we've had one for a long time and nobody's complained about it.
Okay.
It has become, well, that's the part that we object to a little more, so we don't need to get into that. But it became necessary to, it became necessary to freedom and peace of the state that a rule should be laid down, uniform, universal, and permanent, in order to mark out with precision who is that single person. In other words, we got to have a uniform, consistent law to say who that person that becomes king is.
So some kind of standard procedure. We have set the groundwork. This is what we're going by.
And that's the issue that that's the reason why I say that succession in Game of Thrones is a lot more complicated. Because while the English law is very, very clear, set down, plain in stone, right in the English Constitution, exactly who is going to inherit the throne, it doesn't appear to be that clear in Westeros, does it?
No, not really. No,
yeah, I mean, it's if I had to summarize it in my best Shakespearean legalese, I would say that the way it works in Westeros, probably, and this is not my area of law, folks. I'm a lawyer in the United States. I care more about who the next president is than who the next king is going to be. But this is my best attempt at how the laws of succession work in Westeros.
Have you ever gotten sued by a Targaryen?
Not yet. Although we'd be open to bring a case on behalf of somebody that thinks they got a valid claim to some throne, whatever. I find that stuff really interesting. But here's my best stab at the technical legalese for what constitutes the laws of succession in Westeros.
Yeah.
So a lot of, take a step back for a second. I do this a lot, I'm sorry. But the way that a lot of laws of succession work are very similar to how laws of inheritance work. So you've got per capita versus per stirpes when it comes to inheritance. What that means is, say, John, that you're going to die, and you have a son, and you have a daughter, but your son is dead, but your son also has a couple kids, but your daughter is still alive. So the question is, how does it work when property gets divided between these groups? Is it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or is it half and half between the two grandkids and the daughter?
I technically know that answer only because of my position, but
that's the division between per capita and per stirpes. Essentially, the way that the British throne works and the way that I believe the Westerosi throne works is going to be it's going to be a per stirpes right of inheritance.
Okay.
What that means is that there is a right of representation at different levels. So if the king's issue, and issue is all your kids. If your kids are your issue, that's the old-fashioned.
Kids are issues.
Well, issue, singular.
Issue. Okay, yeah, I'm just clearing it up here.
That's the old-fashioned term for your heirs.
Like you were issued something?
Yeah, like you were issued from the king.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So now that the sirens have gone, John, I think that I can continue my answer.
Well, we are in downtown Long Beach. Never a dull moment, folks. So
we like to do these in one take. We didn't screw it up, I promise.
Not this time.
But you can cut that if it doesn't work. What was I talking about?
I'm sorry. The thing was like, oh, cut.
Yeah. We can leave this in, I guess. But okay. So I think both of them are going to be considered equivalent to per stirpes inheritance, which means there's right of representation in both. What right of representation means is that if all of the king's issue fails, so say the king has 12 kids, but all of them die, but some of those kids have grandkids, it can skip over those kids, and the grandkids can be the ones to inherit. In other words, representation means they take on the same position as the person through whose claim they are able to inherit. If that was not too convoluted of a way of saying it.
Well,
so if my dad dies, I stand in place of my dad as an heir, so I get his right. And that's the way it works basically down the whole chain. In England, all the way back to William the Conqueror. In Westeros, I guess probably all the way back to Aegon the Conqueror, if that's the right name. I'm not that well read on my Westeros lore.
But I do have to ask another question with that being said. So let's say, for instance, you had dad, you had you, and you had a son, as a for instance. And God forbid, something happened to you, and you've passed on, you got the angel wings, you have your son, who's your only heir, and your father his plan was to leave all of his estate to you, but you're gone now.
This is a slightly, not quite to that
Not
yet.
quite
This is
there?
a little
Okay.
more complicated.
More
than that.
complicated than that. Okay,
So
okay.
all I'm talking about now is the right of representation issue. It appears that both Westeros and Great Britain have that. So if I were to summarize Westeros's laws of inheritance, I would probably call it something like presumptive cognatic succession with representation by right of inheritance, conditioned upon the consent of the liege lords. Because, we saw in the first couple episodes of House of the Dragon, they've had a couple votes so far. They had that first vote where they picked, what was his name, Viserys over whatever woman wanted to be queen. And then they had the later one, a couple episodes later, where the king appointed his daughter as his heir. So what it appears in Westeros is that you can overcome the presumptive heir. Presumptive heir is pretty much always going to be the king's direct issue. And you can overcome that with somebody that has been assigned by the king and then confirmed by the liege lords. Because when Aegon the Conqueror came in from Valeria. Yeah, when he came in from Valeria, he was able to unite the 7 kingdoms that were already in existence. So right of inheritance works according to the traditional laws laid by those 7 kingdoms. Okay. Therefore, I think if you want to deviate from that traditional mode of doing things, you got to get consent of the 7 kingdoms. I think that's the reason he did that. That's not the way it works in Britain. The way it works in Britain is going to be strictly hereditary.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Inheritance in Britain is always hereditary. There is no vote on who the executive is going to be. And I have another Blackstone quotation on that. He says, "It is of highest importance to the public tranquility and to the consciences of private men that this rule should be clear and indisputable," talking about the rule of succession. And then he says, "I by no means intend to imply a jure divino, or divine right, to rule the throne. Such a title may be allowed to have subsisted under the theocratic establishments of the children of Israel in Palestine, but it has never yet subsisted in any other country, save only so far as kingdoms, like other human fabrics, are subject to general and ordinary dispensations of providence." So he's saying, we have a hereditary succession here, but we don't consider it a divine right of kings. We just sort of have consent of the governed that the way that we're going to pick our next king is by hereditary. So obviously there's a lot of different ways that hereditary succession can work. The way that it works in Britain is under what we call the cognate laws of succession, as opposed to the cognatic, not cognate, as opposed to the agnatic laws of succession. Agnatic would be what they have under the Salic law. That applies in France. Typically it's sort of an ancient Frankish law, but typically what that means is that if the king's issue fails, so if there are no sons, if there are no daughters, and you have to figure out who's king after that, what pretty much every jurisdiction does is they look back all the way to who was the original sovereign from whom everybody else has sort of inherited their right to rule. And they trace back down the line of that person, and they figure, because the existing line is dead, we got to figure out who has the next best claim to the throne. I think sort of the simplistic way we like to look at that is you just look back one generation and maybe it's the king's brother or whatever. That was Stannis' claim, if you remember the original Game of Thrones. It's also, I could give a lot of examples in U.S. history. It's the reason why James was able to succeed Elizabeth, because it's actually not as simple as we just look back one generation. We look back all the way to the original sovereign, and then we trace down, who's the oldest son, if there were no sons, who's the oldest daughter. We look down all the way down till we get to who the next best claim would be after the king who just died. That's what happens if there's a failure of issue. So if there's no kids and no grandkids.
So we have to go back to the original royal
source. William the Conqueror, or Aegon the Conqueror. And that's why in Robert's war for the crown in Game of Thrones, I know way too much about this and I'm exposing myself.
It's okay that you're talking about stuff about GOT, but people might be a little upset if we talk about House of Dragons on here, because I know they're still coming out, so we don't want to give too much.
Oh, we'll just put a spoiler alert in the titles. Sorry about that, guys. But
you're all about disclosure, being an attorney, aren't you?
Oh yeah, just disclose it. You're fine.
Disclosure guy.
But what was I saying? In Robert's War, so because something with whatever Rhaegar had done that made people say that he had an invalid claim to the throne. Now, which can happen. That can happen in Britain too. You can invalidate a claim to the throne. Famously happened with Charles I. They actually cut his head off for it. Famously began his reign at 4'9" and ended it at only 5'8". That's because of Oliver Cromwell. But anyway, that can also happen in Westeros. You can invalidate the throne. invalidate the current monarch's claim to the throne. The reason why Robert was the next to inherit, we're going to go long, but thank you for that cue. The reason why Robert was next to inherit after that was because if you look all the way back to Aegon the Conqueror, assuming all the people from House Targaryen have invalidated their claim, Robert's claim was still the best because he had inherited, I think, through the female line, which suggests that they're using cognatic succession, not agnatic succession. Now, hopefully you guys remember that. I defined it a couple minutes ago.
Well, cognatic,
but,
agnatic, got it.
Yeah, but whether or not the inheritance line can pass through the oldest female is a different issue from whether or not women can inherit. So it appears clear in Westeros that they can inherit through the female line, but it's unclear whether or not women can inherit the throne. That's kind of the basis of the whole conflict in House of Dragons. I mean, interestingly, and this is worth noting, pretty much every society in human history has acknowledged that women can inherit in some circumstances. It's just what those circumstances are.
Right.
If the king has no sons, does it next go to his oldest daughter? And maybe in some jurisdictions it could be that if the oldest daughter is older than the oldest son, maybe it goes to the female heir right away. The way that it works in Britain is they do allow female inheritance. So it's primogeniture, which basically just means that the oldest son gets everything, or the oldest child gets everything. So the way it would go is, say there's 6 kids, you get... that's too many. Let's just say there's 2 kids. There's an older son and a younger daughter. Older son dies, younger daughter can inherit in Great Britain. Now let's flip that. Let's say that the girl is older and the boy is younger. Same thing happens. Younger son would get the throne first. If he dies, then it would go to the older daughter.
Oh, okay.
Now, there's a slight modification to that in Britain because after the Glorious Revolution, they decided they didn't want any Roman Catholics to inherit anymore. So now it goes to the oldest Protestant heir. So most societies are going to be oldest male heir. Now it's oldest Protestant heir.
I detected a bit of the Protestant when they were talking about the Queen believing in Jesus. I thought that was interesting. So.
Yeah, well, she's the head of the Church of England.
Yeah.
And I guess now Charles is the head of the Church of England. So I guess he would not be the first divorced head of the Church of England, because the very first.
Oh, yeah.
Henry VIII.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
But that's the reason the fact you do that look back all the way to the original monarch, that's the reason why James inherited after Elizabeth, because it's you have to trace back several generations to do that. Now that I've gotten way into the weeds on this.
You following along, folks?
Yeah,
Good.
Those are the different issues you can have. In England, that's how it works. Westeros, it appears to be a little different. I think the reason they want to have the uncertainty in Westeros is because they want to have, they're trying to write a show that has conflict in it. Because typically when you get disputed succession in countries, you get civil wars, and they want to encourage civil wars in Westeros, so let's have a really unclear law of succession, then we can have all the fighting we want, and HBO will be happy because you get plenty of heads cut off, hands cut off, and you can show blood all the time. Yeah, well, that's what I think makes a lot of people watch that show.
Right.
I don't think most of them watch it for the laws of succession, although that may be why I watch it, because I'm a very boring man.
Oh, they watch our show for many other different reasons, but
if you're watching our show, you might be of that persuasion as well.
Probably of that caliber.
Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of how it works. Now that I've made it clear, as is the summer sun. Yeah, I guess any follow-up questions on that, or
I do. So the next question would naturally have to be, I know that we do not technically have a monarch, but we do have one individual, the President of the United States, who would be the closest thing that we have.
I mean, it's the description that Blackstone gives pretty darn similar for chief executive. With
that being said, I mean, what are some of the benefits and drawbacks to having a monarchy nowadays? Or
it seems kind of cool that Charles is their king now. Right, we could have a guy like that be king of America. It's just what we want, right?
No.
But
I was actually about to curse right now and say hell no, but no, I don't know if we have to bleep that out or not.
This is for kids, John. That's why we talk about a pornographic TV show the majority of this one. But anyway,
doing it again.
Yeah. It is weird though, because you look at the history of the world, most people have preferred monarchies, right? Like you look at republics, they're pretty new. Most of them don't tend to last very long. It's kind of weird they do that. Blackstone actually does talk about this.
Okay.
He says that in the infancy of a lot of different societies, they often do have some kind of election for how they pick their monarch. and that's almost universally true of infant countries, very, very new countries. I mean, it makes sense because there's a lot of people that already have authority in those countries. They've got to somehow voice who they want their supreme ruler to be if they're going to have a supreme ruler. However, it does seem that countries over time shed this and switch over to monarchy as a system, which seems kind of odd, right? Because we think of monarchy as the older system. We think of elections as the newer system.
Right.
Blackstone says, and I agree with him, that the reason for that is that monarchies tend to be a whole heck of a lot more certain in terms of the stability of your society, much more so than elected governments tend to be. Now, I do think America is the exception here, but let me first explain the general rule before I get to the exception.
Right.
So Blackstone says this. He says, history and observation will inform us that elections of every kind in the present state of human nature are too frequently brought about by influence, partiality, and artifice. And even where the case is otherwise, these practices will often be suspected, and as constantly charged upon the successful by a splentic and disappointed minority. In other words, people dispute elections, whether rightly or wrongly. It's very easy to corrupt an election. It's very easy to accuse somebody of corrupting an election.
Oh God!
I'm not going to get into
current.
current.
No, I mean, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think if our viewers can think of any modern day.
No, that's. I think
example
it'd be too hard to think
maybe,
of one.
Well, I mean, there's nothing current.
No,
nothing current that's
It's
gone
America.
on when
We
it
don't
comes to
dispute our elections ever.
things and
But it's
stuff like
you know,
that.
you're joking about that, but I actually do think America is particularly secure against those kind of accusations, and I'll explain why in a minute.
I'd like to know why.
But going on in Blackstone, he points out the severity of this, or the potential severity of this problem. He says, when the fundamental principles of their common union are supposed to be invaded, in other words, when people do think that they've picked the wrong guy as their next executive, and more especially when the appointment of their chief magistrate is alleged to be unduly made, the only tribunal to which complainants can appeal is that of the god of battles. The only process by which the appeal can be carried on is that of civil and intestine war. And that's the entire basis of Game of Thrones. That is the Game of Thrones, is that civil war that occurs when you challenge who's the next king. That's why Britain's got to have such a secure and well-established constitution for who's going to be the next monarch.
Okay.
That's why they got to do it. And next thing he says, he said, that's why you have a monarchy. A hereditary succession to the crown is therefore now established, and in this and most other countries, because when he was writing, it was true basically everywhere. In order to prevent the periodical bloodshed and misery which the history of ancient imperial Rome and more modern experience of Poland and Germany may show us, are the consequences of elective kingdom. In other words, elective kingdoms tend to get civil war. The other thing he doesn't mention about elective kingdoms is elections were not uncommon throughout history, but usually what all the different lords would do when they voted is they'd all just vote on the king's firstborn son. Elections really up until America were considered to be kind of a formality, because exactly this sort of dispute would occur if you didn't vote on the king's firstborn son. I mean, the reason for that would be pretty obvious. It's if we all agree that the next king is going to be the oldest son of this king, it doesn't really even matter if he's good at the job. We at least avert the possibility of civil war because we've all agreed on the same guy.
Okay, it simply gives stability in knowing who the next leader
Yeah.
is going to be,
It's-
and there's no argument over it.
Yeah,
it just is what it is.
We know he's probably not the best suited for the job, so we're certainly not going to arguably pick the guy best suited for the job. It's the only thing we could argue over is he the legitimate son of the king, which most of the time, that's why it was a big deal if people were, things went on outside the bounds of wedlock, because that way you could challenge that sort of legitimacy. More spoilers for House of the Dragon, by the way. But
The last episode was gnarly.
my gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, we're not recommending this show, by the way, people.
It's something we watch in our spare time. So.
Yeah, we're not proud of it, but we
Nope.
do.
We do. We are human
Yeah.
to the core.
Yeah,
I got you this time.
yeah.
That's one for me, folks. All right, go ahead.
Where the heck was I? That's why. That's fundamentally why you want to have kings, because that's how you avoid disputed succession. That's how you avoid civil wars.
Right.
Now, in America, the way that we managed to control for this was by having a lot of different people have to put a stamp or a seal of approval on an election before it can get to its final result.
Okay.
We go to the polls and we vote, but that's not the only result. I mean, you probably know about the Electoral College. It's got to go through that, right? So state legislatures have to appoint, and according to the Constitution, Article 2, in the manner of their choosing, will appoint electors. So They appoint electors. Those electors then have to go vote. Those electoral votes are then signed and certified by the executive of each state. So usually the governor, a lot of times Secretary of State does it. So that's another person you got to corrupt. So you got to corrupt the people. You got to corrupt people to count the votes. You got to corrupt the electors. You got to corrupt the guy that seals, signs, and certifies those votes when they go to the president of the Senate. And you also got to corrupt the president of the Senate, because president of the Senate opens those slates of electors and then counts those slates of electors. Then even if you corrupted that guy, there's still another check that can happen on top of that, because both houses of Congress have the ability to challenge whatever slate of electors is in front of them. They would then break into their separate houses and they would vote on whether or not they think the challenge is good. Now, we've got a video coming out on the Electoral College. It's been a long time in coming, but it will come out eventually. If I confused you just now, it goes into more depth on all of those things. There's a lot of steps involved in our system. A lot of people need to make mistakes in order for us to get the wrong person in charge.
Well, could we say mistake, but a lot of people in theory would also have to be in collusion together, working together in order for these things to do it?
Well, or, and this is where I was about to go, when we put so much stake on what goes on election night, and when we trust whatever results the media happens to publish, we basically circumvent all of those systems that our founding fathers put in place to protect against civil war, and replace a government of we the people with one that's dictated to us by the news media.
It's not called we the newspaper, it's we the people.
Yeah, and that's, I'm not saying whether that happened in 2020 or not, but I remember, there were multiple news reports where people were saying this election is already decided and done, Trump needs to give up. That is not true. That's how you get a civil war. Right. That's how you get people breaking into the Capitol. Succession of your chief executive is probably the most politically contentious issue a society can have. If they had been open and honest about the whole thing, and they had said, we're going to allow an examination of this, we're going to allow the state legislatures to have their authority, we'll have open hearings in Congress if Congress wants to question the vote in any of these states, we'll even allow separate slates of electors to meet so that we can have alternate slates of electors if that's the route that we choose to go, we'll hear these challenges in court so we can see whether or not the states actually followed their own election laws. That would have been one thing. And I think people would be a lot more confident in the result of the election today, even if it came out the exact same way. It'd be a lot more confident if all of those steps had been gone through than if we just say, nope, it's the next guy, the election wasn't corrupt, stop asking questions.
It's all done, leave it alone.
Because as William Blackstone noticed way back in 1750, even if corruption did not take place, the possibility of people to accuse others of corruption is rampant in elected systems. Right. That's why our founding fathers put in place the system that they did. It's got a lot of safeguards. We should not ignore those safeguards next time around. And I'm not giving any opinion on what the outcome of the election was. YouTube, you've deleted us for that before. Don't do it again. Although this does get deleted, go on Vimeo. It'll still be there, and it'll also be on Rumble. But YouTube, I didn't say that. I didn't say anything about fraud, although I used that word. Bleep out that word,
not to
please.
mention, are we getting political or anything? No, but if you looked at, I think anybody with eyes, Alexander, who cared, anybody who was interested in what are the politics going on in my country. Yeah. We were all up late. We were watching the multiple media outlets, and every single one, when you were just looking at the numbers, had the candidate who's not in office right now actually leading.
I'm not going to give my opinion
on that. Not to say that,
although
no, but I can.
You know my opinion on that,
No, I know what your
John.
opinion is, but I can give my opinion.
But the reason I don't want to go there isn't because I don't think they don't have opinions one way or the other about the evidence. It's because I don't think the evidence frankly matters. Even if the claims were totally bogus that one of the sides was bringing, they deserve to be heard, because this is how you get civil wars. You can't divide your people by telling them that their claims of illegitimacy in an election cannot be heard. You must observe the constitutional procedures and protocols for verifying that the person in office is the right man for the job or woman for the job.
Well, and last time, thanks for clearing that up.
Given the rest of the subject.
We'll get, eventually we'll have a female president. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. But the thing that I think we need to keep in mind is that these traditions are things that have been followed for hundreds of years, because it keeps our system going. It keeps it working. It keeps us from having a civil war. And last time
we don't have a king. In America, the law is king.
The law is king.
Lex Rex, that's our name. The law is
what
king.
It means.
That's a lot harder. It's much harder to maintain a society where the law is king. It's easy to maintain one where a king is a king. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, John.
No, you're fine. You can't dispute it. But at the end of the day, we are trying to keep things going in the right direction for this country. We are trying to inform the populace. And as Americans that are watching this, and anybody, quite frankly, in general, we are allowed to express opinion. We are allowed to say, no, we don't agree, and we'd like you to prove why we think this happened. We'd like you to actually prove to us that a person won or this and that. But instead of that occurring, it was like, shh.
Americans have a
It's okay.
Yeah.
Just be quiet. That's your president.
Americans
Shut up.
have a proud history of calling BS.
We do.
Whether rightly or wrongly. You know, sometimes we call BS and it turns out that it was all totally fine. We've got to do the investigation either way.
Out.
Yeah, that's the reason we have courts of the law. It's the reason we have the system the framers put in place.
And I think it's the reason why you're here.
Trust me on this, folks. If the law is not our king when it comes to succession, we will not have a king. We will have the collapse of our society. Blackstone predicted this. It's the way that every society has gone that decides to go that route. I don't think anything could possibly be more serious. Even if you watch a silly TV show like Game of Thrones, you know how doggone serious it is when people dispute who the next chief executive is going to be.
Very
I
true.
mean, this is well known. This is not something that is rocket science. So.
Well, no, but even not to go into HOD again, but man, even when you know the queen, you know, disputes who she wants to marry, there's like a fight between a couple guys and death breaks out and stuff. So I mean, think how simple that would be if we didn't have that. So thank God for our system first and foremost.
Because we don't want to have a king.
No.
We want to show people that republicanism can work.
It can
Self-government can work.
This
it's been
republic can
unstable historically, but ours is very well thought out, very well structured. Ours can work. Let's just use it.
Well, and why not continue the best trend in history?
Yep.
That's what I'm thinking.
With a number of sirens today, I guess we can see society collapsing around us.
Oh, okay, it's just downtown. It's just downtown.
Interrupted you right in the middle of your speech, John.
Oh, I know.
You'll never get that
I was
momentum
getting
back.
on a pedestal and everything. Everything was going okay. And now I almost forgot where it was. So the reason why you developed this organization, in my opinion, the quintessential reason for this being here is to keep our republic going, is to fight for areas where people are not. Lex Rex, the law is king. Yeah. That is our king. That's the only king we have, and gosh dang it, that's the only king we want to have. And if you're not going to stick by the things that our founding fathers and the people that supported them went by, what are we fighting for?
This is our king.
Right there.
We don't have to appeal to a man. We don't have to appeal to a woman. This is our king. This is our only king, and we better fight to uphold it because it is not going to uphold itself.
Take that, King Charles.
That's all we got to say about that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. You want to make any announcements, or?
I think we should make a couple announcements. Let's. Speaking of the beautiful book, one of my favorites here, the Constitution of the United States with the Declaration of Independence. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization.
I wouldn't trade it for any king in the world.
Nope, none of them. None of them. Even King Charles. But we do have a few opportunities to go to our store. So lexrex.org/donate. If you donate $20 or more, you can get one of these fine pieces of literature.
I think, that made sense, that URL, but I think it's actually lexrex.org/store for the books.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't want to get anything with your donation, you go to the donate page.
Thank you very much. So,
other than the continuation of our republic and the system of the rule of law and constitution that all of us hold dear and that upholds our very way of life. But other than that, you don't get anything.
So lexrex.org/donate to just donate money.
Yeah.
lexrex.org/store if you would like to purchase any of these wonderful books, which would also be considered. Is the purchase?
It's a donation.
Considered a donation?
Yeah, they're free gifts with donations.
Fantastic.
Probably shouldn't call it a store.
That's okay. That's
hopefully
fine.
the IRS isn't watching this. We went long this week. I don't think they'll get to the end.
Very long. They probably won't. But for all the viewers that are still here with us, God bless you and thank you for being here. Once again, this was an episode of Ask an Attorney. I'm your crazy host back, John Aarons, in full force.
Glad to have you back, John.
Alexander, I'm glad to be here, and thanks for doing what you do.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Take care, brother.
You too. Thank you. I am told by our producer that I was not sufficiently complicated in my explanation of the way that British succession works. So prior to 2013, British succession was male preference primogeniture, which means that the male heirs, the male issue of a king would inherit prior to the female issue, irrespective of age. Now that has been modified in 2013 such that it is now absolute primogeniture in terms of inheritance. So the oldest descendant, the oldest issue of the king is the next to inherit. So hopefully, if we weren't complicated enough, that should do it for you
Well,
folks.
Alexander, I'm glad that we had our gracious producer let us know that, because quite frankly, with all due sarcasm, I thought that was the least complicated show we've ever done.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
it's probably just the law that I use least often then.
Anyway, folks, that's it for us. Thank you for being part of Ask an Attorney. John, Alexander, we're out.